Welcome to a Deep Dive. Today, we are really getting into the practical side of designing information and technology governance. We're cracking open the COBIT 2019 Design Guide, specifically focusing on Part 2, which is all about execution and examples. And our lens today is Chapter 6, titled The Governance System Design Toolkit. Think of this chapter as introducing, well, this essential tool for the job. The design guide itself, it outlines the whole process, that workflow, with steps to tailor COBIT to your specific enterprise.
Right, the overall methodology.
Exactly. But this chapter, Chapter 6, it brings in a concrete, practical instrument, an Excel spreadsheet-based toolkit. It's designed to help you actually apply those steps.
Yes, it bridges the gap between the concept of tailoring and the actual execution.
It's about moving from the what and why of tailoring to the how, providing a structured way to take your enterprise's unique characteristics and translate them into specific governance priorities.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
While COBIT provides this really comprehensive framework, 40 potential governance and management objectives.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It is. And no single enterprise needs to implement all of them to the same level of capability or even implement them all, period. The real power of the design guide is in that tailoring.
Making it fit your situation.
Precisely. And this toolkit is built specifically to facilitate that tailoring process. It helps you consider these various design factors, we'll get into what those are, and provides, importantly, a quantitative method.
Putting numbers on it.
Exactly. A quantitative method to prioritize which of those 40 objectives are most crucial for your unique circumstances. It aims to bring a degree of objectivity to that initial scoping process.
So if you've ever looked at the full COBIT framework, maybe felt a bit, overwhelmed.
And it happens.
Right, trying to figure out where to start or how to make it genuinely relevant to your company's strategy or its risks or, its operational model, then this deep dive is definitely for you. We're going to walk through how this toolkit, as Chapter 6 describes it, actually works, step by step, kind of breaking down the engine that powers the tailoring process laid out in the guide.
And our mission today is really to guide you through Chapter 6. Explain the core purpose of the toolkit, its fundamental components, like what's actually inside that spreadsheet.
Yeah, what makes it tick.
Exactly.
Right.
And how it helps an enterprise first determine the initial scope of its governance system based on those foundational factors, and then how it helps refine that scope using more context-specific design factors later on.
So it's about understanding the analytical engine, the calculations that produce those tailored objective lists you see illustrated in the examples back in Chapter 7.
That's it, understanding the how behind those examples.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So diving right into Section 6.1 of the guide, the introduction to this toolkit. What's the fundamental problem it's trying to solve? What's its main purpose here?
Well, the fundamental problem is really the complexity of tailoring itself. COBIT is such a rich framework, right?
Right, lots of options.
Loads. And without a structured approach, deciding which of those 40 governance and management objectives are most important for you, and crucially, to what level you need them, that can feel very subjective, maybe even a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, where do you even begin?
Exactly. So the toolkit is designed as an Excel-based aid precisely to facilitate the application of that governance system design workflow, the workflow we saw detailed back in Chapter 4.
Okay. So it's not a replacement for the workflow itself, the overall steps?
No, not at all.
But it's a tool to help execute parts of it, specifically the analytical parts.
Precisely. Think of the Chapter 4 workflow as the recipe, maybe.
Yeah.
And the toolkit is like a sophisticated kitchen appliance that handles some of the specific measuring and mixing for you.
I like that analogy.
It helps automate some of the analysis and, the calculations involved in the later steps of that workflow. Particularly Step 2, which is determining the initial scope, and Step 3, refining the scope. This makes it much easier to process all the various inputs you gather about your enterprise's context back in Step 1.
That makes sense. It's like having a co-pilot for the design process. It doesn't replace the strategic thinking, does it? Or the discussions you absolutely need to have within the enterprise to gather that input data.
No, it definitely doesn't replace the human judgment.
Or the final design decisions. But it takes away the manual, potentially tedious calculations and correlations.
Exactly right. And a key function, as you mentioned earlier, is translating the more qualitative aspects of the design factors. Your assessments of things like your enterprise's strategy, its risk profile, its threat landscape into more quantitative input.
Bring numbers to descriptions.
These numerical inputs are then processed using built-in mappings and calculations. We'll dig into those provided by the toolkit. And this helps generate a prioritized list of those 40 COBIT objectives. It gives you a more objective, data-driven starting point for that tailoring conversation.
And the guide mentions it was used to generate the results shown in the examples in Chapter 7, right? So
Yes.
when you look at those tailored lists and charts in Chapter 7, you're actually seeing the output of this toolkit
Yeah.
applied to those hypothetical companies.
That's a really important connection to make. The toolkit provides the underlying calculations and the structure for presenting those results for the illustrated examples. It lets the reader understand how those examples arrived at their tailored lists of objectives and maybe target capability levels based on their specific design factor inputs. Kind of pulls back the curtain on the analysis.
Okay. It also notes in the introduction, and this feels important, that this toolkit represents just one specific method for tailoring. It says other valid approaches exist.
Absolutely crucial disclaimer from the guide, yes.
So this isn't the only way to make COBIT work for you.
Definitely not.
Hmm.
This particular toolkit, the one published with the guide, uses a specific quantitative methodology. It's based on predefined mappings and calculations, and it was, chosen for inclusion in this official publication. But the core principle, having a structured, data-informed method to prioritize governance and management objectives based on your enterprise characteristics that can certainly be achieved through other means. Enterprises could use different tools or even develop their own approach as long as it's systematic and defensible.
So the value is really in the structured process, not necessarily only the specific Excel file.
That's it. The value is in the structured thinking and analysis it enables.
Okay, so summarizing that intro. The toolkit facilitates the COBIT design workflow from Chapter 4. It translates those qualitative enterprise characteristics into quantitative inputs, uses built-in logic to process them, and provides the analytical basis for the tailored results we see in the Chapter 7 examples.
Right.
It's a specific quantitative tool to help execute the tailoring method.
Precisely. You can think of it as the engine designed to turn your enterprise's unique data points into prioritized governance objectives.
All right, let's peel back another layer then. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of what's inside this toolkit spreadsheet itself. Section 6.2, Toolkit Basics. What does it actually contain?
Okay, the guide describes it as an Excel spreadsheet, and it's organized into several key components, usually presented in different tabs within the file. First, you have the Input tabs.
Input tabs, okay, where you feed it information.
Exactly. These are where you, the user, enter the information you gathered during step 1 of the design workflow, your assessments about the enterprise's specific characteristics for each relevant design factor.
Like filling out a questionnaire about my company, but structured in Excel.
Essentially, yes. You input the ratings, maybe scores or percentages that reflect your enterprise's specific context for each design factor. Things like your strategic focus, your most significant risks, the severity of your current IT issues, your threat level, and so on.
Got it. Then you have output tabs.
Correct. After you enter the inputs, the toolkit does its processing, and the output tabs graphically represent the results of the calculations for each completed step of the workflow, specifically steps 2 and 3.
Ah, so you see the prioritized lists and the impact visualized. That must be helpful for quickly grasping the outcomes.
Absolutely. The outputs are typically presented in a few different formats to help understanding. You'll see tables showing the calculated scores for each of the 40 objectives.
They're on numbers.
Right. Then often bar charts, which make it really easy to compare the relative importance of objectives visually. And sometimes you might see spider diagrams or radar charts, which can be useful for visualizing the overall profile of priorities across different COBIT domains. These tabs are where you see those prioritized lists that are the direct result of applying your inputs to the toolkit's logic.
Okay, so inputs go in, outputs come out visually. But what's the logic in between? The guide mentions these mapping tables, says they're often hidden but used by the other tabs. What exactly are these mapping tables doing?
These mapping tables are, well, they're absolutely fundamental to how the toolkit operates. They provide the quantitative connection, the bridge, if you will, between the specific values you input for the design factors and those 40 COBIT governance and management objectives.
Okay.
They quantify the relevance or the influence that a specific characteristic of the enterprise, a particular value you selected for a design factor, has on the importance of each individual objective.
Quantify relevance. Can you give me an example? Like, how does the toolkit know that a high-threat landscape makes security objectives more important?
That's precisely what the mapping tables define. For most of the design factors, these tables use predefined values, typically on a scale between 0, 0, and 4.
0 to 4.
0 to 4. A value of 4 signifies the maximum relevance or the strongest influence between a specific value of a design factor. Let's say your enterprise assesses its strategy as primarily growth acquisition, or identifies a high-threat landscape, or rates a particular IT issue like significant security breaches as highly severe,
Right.
and a particular COBIT governance or management objective. For instance, the mapping for high-threat landscape would likely have a 4, linking it to objectives like APO13 managed security or DSS05 managed security services. Conversely, a 0 means basically no relevance or influence.
So if my enterprise inputs indicate a high-threat landscape for design factor 5, the hidden mapping table for DF5 has already been pre-populated with high scores, often a 4, specifically linking that high-threat landscape input value to security-related objectives like APO13 and DSS05, among maybe others.
That's exactly the mechanism. The toolkit uses these predefined relevance scores. And these scores, they were established by an expert panel during the COBIT development process. They represent a sort of consensus view on how different enterprise characteristics typically influence the importance of the COBIT objectives.
An expert panel. Okay, that sounds authoritative. But also based on averages, maybe? Does the guide say anything about whether these scores are like absolute truth, or can they be adjusted? Can every single enterprise's situation really be perfectly modeled by these average scores?
That's a very fair question. And the guide is actually very clear and appropriately cautious on this point. It explicitly states that these values, while established by an expert panel, reflect averages and cannot and do not model every specific individual situation perfectly.
Okay, that's important.
Very. Therefore, they should be used with caution. However, the guide also asserts that they are considered to give good representative indications and provide valuable directional guidance. And crucially, it notes that an enterprise can adapt these mapping tables based on its own experience and context if it genuinely believes the default scores don't accurately reflect its specific situation.
Ah, so you can tweak them if needed.
Yes. This acknowledges that while the toolkit provides a strong baseline derived from collective expertise, it's not designed to be an inflexible system. You can override it if you have a strong justification.
That makes a lot of sense. Provides a great starting point, but allows for local adjustment. So just to recap the flow, I input my enterprise data, the design factor ratings. The hidden mapping tables provide the predefined quantifiable link, those 0-4 relevance scores between my characteristics and the 40 COBIT objectives. Then the calculation tabs process this using the mappings. And the output tabs show me the resulting priorities based on how that specific factor influences things.
That's the core flow and the engine's logic, exactly. The calculation tabs perform the necessary lookups and sometimes matrix operations using your inputs and those mapping tables to produce the scores for each objective.
Okay.
Now, there's one structural variation noted in the guide. It concerns the mapping for design factor 2. Enterprise goals.
Yes, the goals.
For DF2, the toolkit doesn't use a single mapping table directly from your enterprise goals to the 40 objectives. Instead, it applies the COBIT goals cascade principle.
The goals cascade.
Right. It uses 2 internal mapping tables for this. First, it maps your prioritized enterprise goals, that's your input to the COBIT alignment goals, using the mapping in Appendix B. Then it uses a second mapping, Appendix C, to map those resulting alignment goals to the 40 governance and management objectives.
So it reflects that layered relationship. Enterprise goals drive alignment goals, which then drive the lower-level governance and management objectives.
Exactly. The toolkit models that 2-step relationship specifically for goals, while most other factors map more directly to the 40 objectives. It's a structured approach, even with that slight variation for goals, designed to handle the complexity of how all these different enterprise characteristics impact a potentially large number of objectives in a systematic way.
Yeah, it seems designed to handle that complexity systematically. It provides a repeatable way to analyze those interdependencies without users having to manually figure out all the relationships themselves every time.
That's the core benefit right there.
Okay, so the toolkit follows the steps of the design guide workflow. Step 1 is about understanding context, gathering all those inputs we just talked about. Step 2 is specifically about determining the initial scope of the governance system based on what the guide calls foundational factors. How does the toolkit integrate the inputs gathered in Step 1 and process them specifically for Step 2?
Right, this is where the toolkit really starts doing its main job. It takes the quantitative inputs you've gathered during Step 1 for the first 4 design factors, that's enterprise strategy, DF1, enterprise goals, DF2, risk profile, DF3, and current INT-related issues, DF4.
The first four.
Okay, first four. And it processes them to generate that crucial initial prioritization of the 40 governance and management objectives. It translates the assessments you made in Step 1 into tangible scores that define Step 2's initial scope.
So just to be clear, the toolkit isn't where you do the assessment itself, right? That happens through discussions, analysis within the enterprise during Step 1.
Absolutely correct. That's external to the tool.
The toolkit starts with the results of those assessments as its input data.
Precisely. You input the quantified results of your Step 1 analysis. Let's break down how you feed each of these first four factors into the toolkit and what it does with them, following the guide's description in Section 6.3. First up, enterprise strategy, design factor 1.
How do you input your enterprise's strategic focus? What does that look like in the tool?
For design factor 1, you assess and then rate the importance of different COBIT-defined strategy archetypes for your enterprise. The guide references archetypes like growth acquisition, innovation differentiation, cost leadership, and client service stability.
Okay, those broad categories.
Right. Your input involves rating the importance of these for your specific business, typically on a scale, maybe 1 to 5. And the guide emphasizes selecting a primary strategy and perhaps 1 or 2 secondary ones rather than, rating them all highly.
Because if everything's a 5, then nothing's really a priority.
Exactly. It defeats the purpose of prioritization. So once you've rated your key strategy archetypes, the toolkit uses the mapping table found in Appendix A. This table, as we discussed, quantifies how each strategy archetype influences the importance of the 40 COBIT objectives using that 0-4 relevance scale.
Got it.
The toolkit takes your 1 to 5 strategy importance ratings, applies the Appendix A mapping, and calculates a priority score for each of the 40 objectives, specifically based on the influence of your enterprise strategy.
Wow, okay. That's a direct link from high-level business strategy right down to specific INT governance priorities.
Yeah,
makes sense. Okay, next up is enterprise goals, design factor 2. How do you input that one?
For design factor 2, you input your assessment of the importance of the generic enterprise goals listed in the COBIT framework. Figure 2.6 in the guide provides examples, things covering financial performance, customer satisfaction, process efficiency, staff skills, compliance, etc.
Right, those high-level business goals.
Exactly. You rate their importance for your enterprise, again, typically on a scale like 1 to 5. And similar to strategy, the guide really stresses the importance of selecting only a few primary goals and maybe a limited number of secondary goals.
Again, that discipline to avoid making everything a top priority.
Yes. To ensure the resulting objective prioritization is actually meaningful and actionable.
And the calculation for goals is the one that's a bit different, you mentioned, using that goals cascade logic.
Correct. As we touched on before, the toolkit implements the goals cascade for this factor. It uses those 2 mapping tables internally, appendices B and C. First, your prioritized enterprise goals, your input, are mapped to the COBIT alignment goals using the Appendix D mapping. Then those resulting alignment goals are mapped down to the 40 governance and management objectives using the Appendix C mapping.
Okay.
This layered calculation highlights the objectives that are most critical for supporting your specifically chosen enterprise goals. The toolkit calculates a score for each objective reflecting its importance based only on your enterprise goals input.
It's really quite powerful to see how it models that cascading link from those high-level business aspirations right down to the specific INT actions needed. Okay, design factor 3, risk profile. This seems like it would be a major driver for governance priorities.
It absolutely is, often one of the most significant. For risk profile, you input your enterprise's assessment for each of the 19 IT risk categories identified in the risk profile design factor. Figure 2.7 lists examples within these categories, things like project failure risks, security risks, data integrity risks, operational availability risks, vendor risks, etc.
Okay, the different types of IT risk.
Yes, and your input involves rating both the potential impact, typically 1 to 5, and the likelihood, again, 1 to 5 of each of these risk categories occurring in your specific enterprise context.
So critically, the toolkit doesn't use some generic risk level. It uses my specific assessment of impact and likelihood for these different risk types.
That's the crucial part. It has to be tailored to your risk assessment for the results to be meaningful. The toolkit then uses the mapping table in Appendix D. This table quantifies the extent to which each of the 40 governance or management objectives acts as a control or mitigation for each of those 19 risk categories.
Okay.
The toolkit performs a calculation, often a matrix calculation, combining your assessed impact and likelihood ratings with this Appendix D mapping to generate a priority score for each objective. Objectives that are identified as strong controls for your most significant assessed risks, high impact, high likelihood, will naturally receive higher priority scores from this factors calculation.
So if cyber attacks are rated as having high likelihood and high impact for my company, objectives related to security management, like APO13 or DSS05, will get a significant boost in priority from this risk factor input.
Exactly. It directly links your specific risk exposure profile to the governance capabilities needed to manage that risk effectively.
Makes sense. And finally, for this initial scope step, design factor 4, current INT-related issues. What's the input here?
For design factor 4, you input your assessment of the importance, or perhaps the severity of current real-world INT-related problems or pain points that your enterprise is actually experiencing right now. Figure 2.8 in the guide gives examples things like poor user satisfaction with IT services, frequent operational outages, persistent issues with data quality, or maybe significant cost overruns in IT projects.
The stuff that's causing headaches today.
Precisely. Your input is typically on a scale, like 1 to 3 maybe, indicating how important it is to address these specific issues.
So, rating how much these current problems are actually hurting the business or impeding goals.
Exactly. The toolkit then uses the mapping table in Appendix E. This table links these common types of INT issues to the governance and management objectives that, if implemented effectively, can help resolve or mitigate them. It calculates a priority score for each objective based on your severity ratings for the issues and this Appendix E mapping. Objectives that help address your most pressing current issues will naturally be prioritized higher by this factor.
Okay, so for step 2, the toolkit takes inputs on strategy, DF1, goals, DF2, risk, DF3, and current issues, DF4. It calculates a potential priority score for each of the 40 COBIT objectives based individually on the influence of strategy, then goals, then risk, then issues, using their respective mapping tables.
Correct. 4 separate influence scores per objective.
How does it combine these 4 separate sets of scores into the final initial scope output for step 2?
Right, that's the final part of the Step 2 processing, and it's described in Section 6.3.5. The toolkit performs a weighted summation of the calculated importance scores for each governance and management objective derived from these first 4 design factors.
Weighted summation. Okay, how does that work? And why weighted? What does that mean practically?
Okay, so it means that for each objective, the toolkit takes the score calculated based on DF1, strategy, adds it to the score based on DF2, goals, adds that to the score based on DF3, risk, and adds that to the score based on DF4, issues. Simple summation so far.
Right.
The weighted part means that you, the user, can assign different importance levels or weights to each of these 4 design factors before they are summed up. For instance, if your enterprise is currently highly focused on addressing critical risks, you might decide to assign a higher weight to the risk profile factor input, DF3, than, say, to the enterprise strategy input, DF1, when calculating this initial scope.
Okay. So I can actually tell the toolkit that for my company right now, maybe addressing risk is strategically more critical than aligning perfectly with a long-term strategy document, and the toolkit factors that emphasis into the combined initial score.
Exactly. The default weight for all factors is typically set to 1, meaning they contribute equally to the sum. But you have the flexibility to adjust those weights based on your specific situation and current strategic priorities. The toolkit then sums up these weighted scores for each objective across those first 4 factors.
Got it. What happens after the summation?
Then, according to the guide, the resulting raw scores are typically normalized on a standard scale, often from -100 to +100.
Normalization. Right. That helps make the scores comparable and easier to interpret, doesn't it?
It does. A score of +100 would mean maximally important in this initial assessment, based on these 4 foundational factors and your weighting. And -100 would mean minimally important, relative to some baseline or average state. It puts all the objectives on the same scale relative to each other.
Makes it easy to see which ones bubble to the top.
Yes, making it much easier to see which objectives rise to the top in this initial assessment. The Step 2 Summary Output tab in the toolkit presents this initial prioritized list. It shows the normalized scores in tables and visualizes them in bar charts, or maybe those spider diagrams we mentioned. Figure 7.13 in Example 1 actually shows this kind of output.
Okay.
This weighted normalized score gives you the initial set of governance and management objectives that appear most important for your tailored system based on these fundamental enterprise characteristics: strategy, goals, risk, and current issues.
That provides a really solid data-driven foundation for the initial scope, doesn't it? Directly linking those key enterprise drivers to INT governance priorities. That feels like a powerful first step.
It is. It grounds the subsequent steps in a clear, reasoned starting point.
Okay, so step 2. processed by the toolkit, gives us that initial prioritized list based on our enterprise's strategy, goals, risk, and current issues. Now, step 3 of the workflow, which is also facilitated by the toolkit, as described in section 6.4, is about refining that scope. How do the remaining design factors, that's DFI through DF10, come into play, and how does the toolkit handle those?
Right. Step 3 in the toolkit processes the inputs for design factors 5 through 10 to further refine or maybe adjust that initial scope determined in step 2. The fundamental mechanism is pretty similar. You input enterprise-specific information for each factor, and the toolkit uses mapping tables to calculate the influence of that factor on objective importance.
Same basic engine, different inputs.
Exactly. But the inputs now reflect different organizational characteristics, often more operational or environmental ones, and the calculations provide a different perspective, a refinement layer on objective importance.
Let's go through these refining factors one by one then, and see how the toolkit uses them. First up, design factor 5, threat landscape.
Okay, threat landscape, DF5. For this one, the input involves quantifying the proportion of your enterprise's overall operations, or maybe its IT environment, that is subject to a high threat landscape versus a normal threat landscape.
Okay.
You input this using percentages, and critically, these percentages must sum up to 100%.
So if my company handles highly sensitive financial data for one division, maybe that's high, but has standard corporate IT for another division, maybe that's normal, I could represent that mix, say 30% high, 70% normal.
Exactly. While many companies might simplify and assess themselves as entirely high or entirely normal, the toolkit allows for that nuance if different parts of your business genuinely face different threat levels. Your input those percentages is then processed using the mapping table in Appendix F.
Appendix F for threats. Got it.
The toolkit calculates a relative importance score for each objective based on your specific high normal percentage split and that Appendix F mapping. The output shows how the threat landscape factor, considered in isolation, influences objective prioritization. You see visualizations like Figure 7.16 in the examples for this.
Okay. Makes sense that a high threat landscape would push security objectives higher. Next, design factor 6, compliance requirements.
Very similar input structure for compliance requirements, DF6. Here, you rate the proportion of your enterprise subject to high, normal, or low compliance requirements. Again, using percentages that must sum to 100%.
So this captures the varying regulatory or maybe contractual obligations across different business units or operations, like HIPAA for healthcare data, PCI DSS for payments, GDPR for European customer data.
Precisely. Or maybe just standard corporate governance is normal or low. It allows you to reflect where the significant compliance burdens actually lie within the organization. This input uses the mapping table in Appendix G.
Appendix G for compliance.
Right. And the calculation combines your percentages with the Appendix G mapping to give a relative importance score for each objective based purely on your compliance requirements profile. You see outputs like Figure 7.18 showing this. High compliance needs will strongly prioritize objectives related to regulatory adherence, monitoring, and assurance.
Makes sense. Okay, design factor 7, role of IT.
For role of IT, DF7, you input the proportion of IT's function within the enterprise that aligns with different COBIT-defined archetypes. These are support, factory, turnaround, or strategic.
4 roles.
Yes. And again, you provide percentages summing to 100%.
So it's not just asking if IT is strategic overall, but it recognizes it might play different roles in different areas of the business. Like maybe it's strategic for product development, but factory for back office processing.
Exactly that nuance.
Yeah.
In some areas, IT might be primarily viewed as a utility factory or just fixing problems, turnaround. While in other, perhaps newer or more critical areas, it's seen as a key enabler of business innovation and strategy. Strategic. The toolkit lets you capture that complexity. It uses the mapping table in Appendix H.
Appendix H for role of IT. And the calculation gives you a relative importance score based on this mixed role of IT, like Figure 7.20 shows.
Correct. And you'd expect that if IT plays a significant strategic role in your input mix, objectives related to innovation, like APO4, enterprise architecture, APO3, and business relationship management, APO8, would likely score higher from this factor's influence.
Okay. Design factor 8. Sourcing model for IT.
This input, for sourcing model, the F8, captures how your enterprise actually sources its IT services. You rate the proportion using outsourcing, cloud, or in-source models. Again, percentages summing to 100%. The guide also mentions hybrid as a common approach.
Which you'd represent here by using percentages across multiple models, right?
Exactly. So if you use Salesforce, say, which is cloud, Manage your own network internally, which is insourced, and maybe have some application development outsourced.
Yeah, a typical mix these days.
Right. You'd show that split with the percentages. This input uses the Appendix I mapping.
Appendix I for sourcing.
Yes. The calculation yields a relative importance score for each objective based on your specific sourcing model mix. Figure 7.22 shows an example. You'd expect heavy reliance on outsourcing or cloud to emphasize objectives related to vendor management, like APO 10, and managing service agreements, APO 9.
Makes sense. Okay, design factor 9. IT implementation methods.
For IT implementation methods, DF9, you input the proportion of IT development or delivery activities using Agile, DevOps, or traditional methods. Waterfall, perhaps. Percentages summing to 100%, again. This captures the diversity of approaches often found even within a single IT department.
Yeah, definitely not every project uses the same methodology these days.
Appendix J mapping for this one. Correct. Appendix J. The calculation gives a relative importance score based on your mix of implementation methods. FANG 7.24 shows an example. You'd probably see that a higher proportion of Agile or DevOps in your input would prioritize objectives related to things like iterative development, automated deployment, continuous integration maybe affecting BAI ISO 2, managed requirements definition, BAIO 3, managed solutions identification and build, or BAIO 6, managed IT changes.
Okay, reflecting the different control needs of those methods. And finally, design factor 10, technology adoption strategy.
Last one. For step 3 calculations, input for technology adoption strategy, DF10, involves rating the proportion of your enterprise that follows a first mover, follower, or slow adopter approach when it comes to adopting new technologies. Once again, percentages summing to 100%.
This makes sense too. Different parts of a business might be bleeding edge, R&D maybe, while others like finance or HR might be very conservative.
Exactly. Allows for that internal variation in technology appetite. This uses the Appendix K mapping.
Appendix K for adoption strategy.
Yes, and the calculation gives a relative importance score based on your technology adoption strategy mix. Figure 7.26 shows an example. Being a significant first mover would likely prioritize objectives around managing innovation, APO 04, strategic planning, APO 2, and managing emerging technologies within the architecture related to APO 3.
Okay, that covers design factors 5 through 10. But the guide makes a very specific point about design factor 11, enterprise size, in section 6.4.7. It states it's not included in the toolkit's calculations for prioritizing objectives. Why is that one design factor excluded from the toolkit's analytical engine? That feels a bit counterintuitive.
Yes, that's a really important clarification in the guide, and it often surprises people initially. The toolkit does not use enterprise size, DF11, to calculate the priority or the target capability levels for the 40 governance and management objectives themselves.
So size doesn't influence which objectives are important or how important they are. Why not? Wouldn't a huge company need different governance than a tiny one?
Well, the guide explains the reasoning this way. Enterprise size, in the specific context of the COBIT Design Guide framework, primarily serves as an indicator. It's an indicator of whether the small and medium enterprise, SME focus area guidance, should potentially be applied instead of or alongside the core COBIT guidance.
Ah, so it's like a flag, telling you which set of implementation details might be more relevant.
Exactly. It's a flag for which version or subset of implementation specifics to perhaps look at. The guide explicitly states that enterprise size has no impact on the inherent priority and the target capability levels of the 40 governance and management objectives themselves. The fundamental importance of, say, managing risk effectively or ensuring compliance doesn't magically change just because an enterprise is small versus large.
Okay.
The way you implement the related processes and components, the level of formality, the specific practices that might change significantly based on size. But the objective itself, like managed security, remains relevant if the drivers, like threat landscape or risk, indicate it is.
Ah, I think I see. Size dictates how you might implement the objectives, the complexity, the formality, the specific components you choose, maybe even which focus area guidance book you reference. But it doesn't change that the objective of, say, managed security is important if your other design factors, like threat or risk, say it is. The toolkit is focused purely on the prioritization of the objectives themselves.
It's exactly right. The decision about whether to leverage SME guidance is made based on size. The guide gives criteria like 250 or fewer full-time equivalents, FTEs, in section 4.4.7 as an example. But this decision is separate from the toolkit's core function, which is analyzing design factors DF1 through DF10 to prioritize those 40 objectives.
Got it. That clarifies why DF11 isn't part of the calculation engine. So After inputting factors 5 through 10, what's the output of step 3 within the toolkit itself? What does it show me?
Okay, so the Step 3 calculations in the toolkit result in, essentially, another prioritized list of the 40 COBIT objectives, similar in format to the Step 2 output. But the Step 3 output specifically reflects the relative importance of each objective based solely on the combined or individual influence of the inputs for design factors 5 through 10.
So it shows how things like threat, compliance, role of IT, sourcing, methods, and adoption strategy are pushing the priorities.
It's exactly. The Step 3 Summary tab, shown conceptually in Figure 6.4.8 in the Toolkit Overview, and in detail in the Chapter 7 examples like Figure 7.14 or Figure 7.42, presents these results. Again, often normalized, showing how these refining factors influence objective importance.
This sounds like I potentially end up with multiple perspectives on priority from the toolkit. I get the initial scope from step 2 based on the foundational factors, strategy goals, risk, issues. And then I get these refined perspectives from step 3 based on the other factors, threat, compliance, role of IT, etc. How does the overall design process, which clearly goes beyond just chapter 6 and the toolkit's calculations, actually combine all of this information, the results from step 2 and step 3? How does it get to the final tailored governance system design?
That's the critical next stage, and it takes us into the subsequent steps of the overall governance system design workflow described back in Chapter 4. Specifically, Step 4, which is about resolving conflicts and concluding the design. This is illustrated extensively in Chapter 7. You see figures like 7.27 or 7.71, which show the final combined priority lists that result from considering all the relevant design factors together.
Oh, okay.
So, Chapter 6, the chapter we're focused on, explains only how the toolkit calculates the outputs for Step 2, based on DF14 combined, and Step 3, based on DF510, either individually or potentially combined. The actual conclusion, the reconciliation, and importantly, the resolution of conflicts between the different priority lists or scores generated by all the design factors. That is described as a manual step.
Manual, so not automated by the toolkit.
Correct. It's performed by the design team using their judgment and understanding of the enterprise context. They're informed by all the quantitative outputs from the toolkit, but they make the final calls.
Ah, okay. So the toolkit gives you the objective data, the quantitative analysis showing how each factor pushes objective priorities in certain directions.
Yes, the evidence base.
But the final decision on the combined priority list and maybe the target capability levels for those prioritized objectives, that's a human judgment exercise in step 4.
Exactly. The toolkit might show you, for instance, that your risk profile, DF3, strongly pushes for certain security objectives to be top priority, while maybe your innovation strategy, DF1, strongly pushes for architecture and development objectives. If those sets of objectives aren't exactly the same, the toolkit's individual factor outputs might show conflicting high priorities.
Right, different factors pulling in different directions.
Step 4 is where the design team, using their professional judgment and deep understanding of the enterprise's overall strategy and tolerance for risk, reviews all the toolkit's outputs. They look at the Step 2 initial scope, they look at the Step 3 refinements, they resolve any conflicting priorities or overlaps, they confirm the final list of key objectives that truly matter most, and then they set the appropriate target capability levels for those objectives. The toolkit provides the essential objective data to inform that crucial final design step.
Wow, okay. This toolkit sounds incredibly valuable then. Not as a magic bullet, but as a way to bring structure and quantitative analysis to what could otherwise feel like a very subjective, maybe even political process of tailoring governance. It forces you to systematically consider all these different internal and external factors that make every enterprise's needs unique.
It provides a robust, data-driven foundation, absolutely. By translating potentially abstract characteristics like enterprise strategy, specific risks, painful current issues, external threat levels, internal IT operating models, and technology appetite into prioritized governance and management objectives, well, it helps ensure that implementation efforts are focused precisely where they will deliver the most value and address the most critical needs for your specific context.
Yeah, it's not just pulling governance objectives out of a hat, is it? It's tying them directly, demonstrably, back to the enterprise's specific reality.
Precisely. It elevates the conversation from maybe just generic best practices, we should do security, to a highly specific targeted approach derived directly from your enterprise's unique DNA, its strategy, its risks, its issues, its operational environment. It provides that necessary quantitative analysis to underpin the critical decisions made in Step 4 about the final tailored governance system design.
So the key takeaway from this deep dive into Chapter 6 and the COBIT 2019 Design Toolkit seems to be that designing a governance system isn't, or at least shouldn't be, a guessing game. It's not a matter of blindly adopting a template either.
No, one size definitely does not fit all here.
It's a systematic process of tailoring. And tools like this toolkit provide the analytical horsepower to systematically consider what makes your organization unique, its specific drivers and context, and use that information to prioritize governance efforts effectively. It gives you the objective data needed to make informed choices about where to invest your limited governance energy for maximum impact.
It really moves you from asking, what should we do, based on maybe generic ideas or what others are doing, to asking, what must we focus on and why, based on a structured analysis of our specific enterprise characteristics.
Which leads me to a final thought, something for you, our listener, to consider as you wrap your head around this. Given the systematic way the COBIT Design Guide and this toolkit connect enterprise characteristics directly to governance priorities, how well does your current approach to designing or evolving IT governance explicitly reflect the truly unique aspects of your enterprise, its specific strategy, its particular risk profile, its distinct operating environment?
That's a good question.
Are you focusing your limited resources, time, money, people on the governance objectives that matter most, objectively determined by your specific situation? Or are you perhaps applying a more generic model, maybe one inherited or borrowed, that might not actually be the best fit for where your organization is today and where it's heading tomorrow?
Something definitely worth reflecting on.
That's something significant to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Chapter 6 of the COBIT 2019 Design Guide, exploring the Governance System Design Toolkit. We hope this look under the hood helps you understand how frameworks like COBIT provide powerful, practical tools to build governance systems that are not only comprehensive, but also truly tailored and ultimately more effective.